go straight into our next presentation, and then I promise you get a lunch break after that. So everyone, hold tight for a minute.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks.
Ready? Okay.
All right, we're going to get started. How we doing? This is awesome, right? Okay, so our next speaker, I'm really excited to introduce. Josh Martin is a vice president at Ideas42, which is responsible for overseeing behavioral science intervention programs in diverse fields from domestic financial aid reform to international livelihood programs. Prior to joining Ideas42, Josh was a policy advisor at Côte d'Ivoire at Ministry of Planning and Development, and he's previously held posts at the Cordoba Initiative and Princeton University's Empirical Studies of Conflict program and roles at the World Bank, USAID, the National Democratic Institute, and others. I also heard he's a heck of a dancer. Josh has a master's from Harvard University School of Government and speaks Arabic and French. Everybody give a hand to Josh.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Speaker's right here, so I have no idea if it's way too loud or way too soft. This is kind of ironic. I know less about financial aid and higher education in general than almost everyone sitting in this room, and yet I'm what's standing in between you and your lunch, so I hope you'll forgive me to start with. I work for something called Ideas42. We do applied behavioral science work, and we try to improve policy in higher education as well as in other domains using what we call behavioral science. What is behavioral science? We'll get to that in a second. But first, there's this fundamental challenge that I've actually heard a lot about, even in just the last couple hours that I've been sitting in sessions in the conference from people that have been asking questions and from people that have been speaking on the stage. And the problem goes something like this. We know that students should be doing something. We're doing our best effort so that they do that. We're investing in all the right ways. We're innovating in really interesting and frontline types of ways in order to get them to do those things. But for some reason, there's some message that's just not getting through, right? We're doing everything we can, but for some reason, students just don't seem to be doing the thing that we want them to do. And here are just some problems, and this is going to focus on the repayment end of the spectrum, but nevertheless, I think applicable really throughout the field. Some problems that we see that fit into this domain quite easily. So first of all, falling into delinquency, right? So basically another way of saying that is just not making payments on their loans. Choosing the wrong repayment plan. Not picking up the phone when someone calls them to try to help them work out the situation. Whether it's not applying for government debt relief programs, such as forbearance, sending in the wrong documents to change their plan or to sign up for programs, or sliding potentially into default, right? And that's where the real crisis is. And so, what is it about students or borrowers in this case that prevents them from doing what they should be doing, right? What is standing in the way between people and the actions that we know are in their best interest and that we're doing our best to try to encourage them to take? Well, let's take a diversion. So there are just when we look around the world around us, there's just all kinds of weird things that we start to notice, right? And this doesn't have to be the students or the borrowers that we're serving. This can be us, right? This might as well have been me. Last week I went to the gym. The key thing about this is to realize that someone actually designed this environment. So somebody decided that the right way to have a gym was to have an escalator leading up to it. So people just get right out of their cars and they get right on the escalator and then presumably they go onto their treadmill, right? But there's some calories that they might have missed along the way if that was really what they wanted to do, was to shed calories. Similarly, people tend to avoid obvious danger, right? Again, acting in their, not in their best interests. And this as well might have been taken in my own apartment where, if my intention, again, is to work out, clearly there's something getting in between me and fulfilling that intention. And something that we all tend to do pretty much every day, if you think about if you think about why you set an alarm, it's because you know the night before that next morning when you need to wake up, you're going to have all kinds of problems doing so. So you have an intention, a very well-formed intention to wake up at a certain time. You've even set a plan to do so. You probably have a calendar that gives you a reason to wake up at that time. But you know that's going to be all kinds of difficult for you when the time comes. And so setting an alarm, in a sense, is acknowledging the difficulty that you're going to have in following through on your intention, and is giving your future self ammunition against what you know are going to be your own self-control shortcomings. So what does this say about our brains, okay? Well, we have science that shows us a little bit of how the brain works. And these are the insights that we're trying to apply. And it's worth meditating for a second on what this thing is, okay? This is a machine that sits between our ears. It's a massive gray matter, weighs about 3 pounds. And it's evolved over millennia to help us solve certain problems extremely, extremely well, and yet is massively unsuited to the kinds of contexts that we find ourselves in the modern world, all right? And the question is, what is it about these neural pathways that explain how we make decisions and how we take actions and where those processes can go wrong? And rather than explain it to you, I'm gonna ask you to do a little activity. So, you have one job here, and that is to say aloud the color that I'm going to show you on the screen. I'm going to show you different shapes. They're going to be different colors. All you have to do is say aloud which one they are, right? Let's try one here. Ready? And. Great. All right, you guys are great. All right, and next one. Great, a little bit faster now. And. Right? And you knew as I was doing this that I was trying to play some kind of trick on you. Or you weren't sure what trick I was trying to play, but I pretty much gave it to you right up front, said that this is going to be a trick. And it happens every time, okay? Like, it's, every time we get some version of bread. And the question is, why does that happen? It's because our brains, again, work in certain ways that are extremely predictable. So they seem to be, you seem to get this kind of puzzling response from people about things like, if they intend to wake up at a certain time in the morning, but they don't, why is that, what went wrong? Well, it's again that our brain takes features of the context in which we make decisions and take actions and garbles them up and translates them into the actions that we actually take. And they look very different than what we mean to do. And this is just a kind of toy example that shows you that if I know something about the context in which you're going to sit, in which you're going to do something, take some action. In this case, it's say, give me the color of the shape I'm telling you. And I know something about the way that the brain works, I can basically tell you, I can predict what your response is going to be. And this is actually very important because it's not that people are totally irrational, right? So here are two models of the world that we tend to have in mind when we work with students or borrowers or really anyone in any policy domain. Either we think that they're kind of hyper-rational, able to calculate and process immense amounts of information at a time, or on the other hand, that they're kind of these, bumbling, reductions of themselves and who kind of can't get anything right? It's not that either one of those is true. It's that we're somewhere in the middle where our brain responds very rationally to the situations that it presents itself with, subject to the constraints of the environment in which we make those decisions. And so a science is developed around this idea. It's not, it's not rationality or irrationality. It's called bounded rationality. So this idea that we do the best we can, but we're not always great at getting it right. Okay, and if we know something about the context in which we make decisions and take actions, we can pretty much predict what people are going to do. And that should be relevant for policy. So where might student borrowers have to think very carefully, right? Where might they have to decide what's blue and what's red, for example, in the kind of toy context I showed you a second ago? Well, one, quite obviously, is when they're filling out their FAFSA application, right? And you can tell from the way that this looks that might not be the easiest thing to do if you're working in this kind of automatic type way, and you're simply responding to the context that you see. This is not a great context to promote careful decision making. Another one might be course registration. Right, so if you have to register for certain courses that make you eligible for financial aid or promote your pathway to completion or something like that, choosing from among, let's say 17,000 courses at some large community college in Orlando that we've worked with is going to present you some problems. Oop. And choosing among aid options, right? And that's certainly a theme of what's been discussed here. Is how do we take these options that we see in front of us and make some kind of realistic decision about what our financial capabilities are going to be and what makes sense for us. So it's worth reflecting again on the way that we believe people are making these decisions, right? Often implicitly within the policies and the programs that we design to help people, we have a model of the way that people decide. And it goes something like this. If I want something, I figure out what it takes for me to get it, and then I get it. I simply execute it, and I get the thing that I want. And if I don't, I don't, right? But in reality, it looks a little bit more like this. So I might know what I want. In fact, I might have a very clear idea of what I want. I may even figure out what I should do to get it. But at that point, all kinds of things are going to start to intervene. So is it easy for me to do? Is it going to be a hassle? Is it going to make me look bad among my friends? Right? Is it going to take a long time? Is there a possibility of procrastinating it to some other time? Right? Am I in the right mood? I mean, all these other things can come into play, and it's worth just recognizing that this is not a linear process, that a lot of things can throw us off as we go through. So let's give you an example. So this is actually comes from a quite famous study in 2009 by Phil Ariopoulos and his colleagues, where they looked at applying for financial aid, all right? And they're dealing with this problem of the fact that students are not applying for financial aid even though they're eligible for it. And something like 30% of students that are eligible for financial aid that end up applying to college never actually apply for financial aid, which is incredible if you think about it, right? Financial aid is like the equivalent of, in many cases, tens of thousands, if not more, dollars, and they're simply just leaving it out there on the table, something that's obviously not in their best interest. So why are they doing this? Well, in a traditional perspective, maybe they lack information, right? That's the most obvious thing. Maybe they just don't know that financial aid's out there. Perfectly reasonable. Or maybe they don't want or need the aid in some reason, so maybe they're eligible, but they just don't feel the need. Or maybe not enough aid is available, and so they're trying, but not accessing this aid in some way, right? And these are all perfectly logical explanations for this phenomenon. But my claim is that they don't tell the whole story. So what if the form is just simply a hassle to fill out? Right? Or what if it contains things that make people question whether they're even right for college, right? So one of the things they found on the study is that when you fill out the FAFSA, one of the first questions it's asking you to do is to list your family's assets, right? Now, if you don't have any assets, it's going to, and especially if you're a first-time in college type student, it's going to seem like you're not the right person that should be filling out this form. There's a kind of implicit recommendation within that, an implicit statement about the people around you that are doing this form because they do have family assets, right? So if I don't, it's going to make me seem out of place. And so they did in the study was they simply offered these like very, very short counseling sessions for students where they literally just walked them through the beginning part of the form and looked over their shoulder as they filled in a couple of boxes. And that was it. And that by itself not only led to a massive increase in students applying for financial aid, but also ultimately in enrolling for college down the road, right? If you think about it, which has very little to do with the decision to apply for financial aid for those 30% of people who would have enrolled anyway. So, that's speaking to the second issue of encouraging people, giving them that little push at the very beginning of the process to get them started along the way. And that probably has very big downstream effects. So I'll tell you a little bit about Ideas 42 and how we look at these problems. And the goal is to help you guys think about how you might use this type of methodology in your setting, right? So the first thing that we do is we define the behavior that we want to change. So whether it's getting people to make a more informed loan decision, or whether it's getting people to take only the credits that will advance their completion path. Whatever that is, we have to define what that behavior is that we care about and why we want to pursue it. Then we diagnose. So what that means is now we look at the context in which people are making that decision or taking that action. And what about the context might be influencing them to take it one way or the other? So if it's about borrowing decisions, what about the way in which people are selecting? What do they see when they're selecting? What do they hear? What do they experience as they're selecting their loan decision, their loan amount? And how might that be influencing that, right? And that's where the literature comes in. So that's where the science comes in, because the science gives us a way to know from the context how people are likely to act. And now we design. So now if we know something about why people are making a certain choice or decision, we can try to intervene to influence that feature, to reduce the influence of whatever it is that we think is throwing people off course. So if it's one of the studies that we recently completed had this idea that when people select borrowing amounts, if the box is already full for people, so if it gives you by default the maximum amount that you could borrow, guess what? People are likely to select the maximum amount. So the solution to that might be as simple as having that box be empty and not pre-filled, right? That actually forces people to think through, well, how much money do I want to borrow? And that leads to much lower borrowing amounts. Right, so first we figured out what the design is here. What's the feature that we want to influence? And it can be a tiny, tiny feature of the context that we think is making the difference. And then ultimately we test it. And so we run these rigorous scientific trials to figure out whether these things actually work, which is very important because the effects that we're looking for often are not huge, but nevertheless are important because they're very scalable. So these designs are almost always very, very low cost. And so it's important to be able to use a very sensitive instrument like a scientific randomized trial to be able to say that this 5% reduction in borrowing amounts, for example, is significant in order to make the case that it's worth the cost of just making this tiny little tweak. And it's much more complicated. I'm not going to get into it, but just so you know. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples here. And this, again, is going to be more on the repayment side. But we've just finished publishing the results of 14 randomized controlled trials of these types of small behavioral tweaks that we've made in policies and programs around the country. It's called Nudging for Success. I believe it's in your packet. If not, you can just Google Nudging for Success on Google, and you should find it pretty quickly. And this contains results of all these trials. I'm going to show you a couple in the more repayment domain, because I think that's probably the most directly relevant to what we're talking about today. So we worked with Great Lakes, who you might know as a major student loan servicer. We actually work with their guarantor arm, which is the arm that's responsible for reaching out to borrowers who are already in delinquency. We wanted to test out how we can help borrowers access debt relief programs. And it really speaks to this issue of helping people get somewhere that they themselves want to go. That's obvious that it's in their best interest. And just a couple of quick statistics. So 1 in 4 student loan borrowers are either already in delinquency or default. Millions and millions of borrowers are at least a month behind on their payment. And yet we have these programs which are designed to help people at least manage that situation that people are by and large not using. So how do we deal with that? Well, first we got to understand the process. Okay, so what behaviors are relevant along the pathway from being in delinquency to signing up for one of these programs? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to pick up the phone. Okay, they're going to call you, and you need to know that they're calling you and pick up the phone. You have to then apply for a different type of repayment plan or select what you're going to do about this. Either it's apply for a repayment plan or apply for one of these programs, and then fill out the application that gets you into one of these programs, and then ultimately send it back, right? And each of these things seems like a tiny decision, and it seems like if I get even to the first point, I should easily be able to make it all the way through. But that's actually not what we see. So even though these seem like tiny steps, anything can intervene at the moment. So how did we address this? Well, the first thing we did is we sent people a bunch of emails. Okay, so again, as you can see, the reasons why this might not be working. So at the first stage, for example, it might be that people just aren't picking up the phone because they don't want to hear bad news, and they know that it's a debt collector. But another reason that's not on here is what if they don't know that this person reaching out to them is trying to help them? So what if this just seems like junk mail or some kind of spam call, right? And they don't actually know that this is coming from someone who's been contracted to try to get them out of this situation. And then at any other point, you have hassles that come in, additional complexity. So all these things I've talked about already that intervene to prevent people from taking this next step. So how do we address it? Well, we designed, first of all, a checklist that we sent to people to try to make these steps super clear, right? Try to reduce the complexity. And one thing that's not on here is we sent people a bunch of emails even earlier in the process. So we sent people emails even before they got the call that simply say, expect a call. Right? You're going to get called by someone who's going to help you. And here's what they're going to say. And crucially also, here are the documents to help you get prepared for that, so that they could spend some time and actually get themselves prepared for that moment to reduce the hassle of having to take some action once they get called. The other thing that we designed, which we're particularly proud of, I have to say, is this thing we're calling the document jacket. So one of the problems with this is the form itself, right? So once they send you the form is this nasty kind of, governmentese form that you have to read and actually ask you to take some very important decisions that are very difficult to take. You have to decide like exactly how much money you want to put aside. You have to calculate, in some cases, like for IBR, you have to calculate, whether your income is above a certain threshold from the minimum kind of eligible income. I mean, all these various things, and it's quite difficult to figure out. In fact, we couldn't even figure it out in our office. Maybe you could because you're experts. But in any case, we designed this kind of aid, which is a version of a checklist in a sense, but it fits over the actual form. So even though we couldn't change the form itself because it requires legislation and all kinds of other things, we could at very least overlay this resource on top of the form to walk people more clearly through to the decisions and actions they have to make along the way. And so we thought that would help reduce some of the complexity, and we were able to then translate the governmentese into kind of easily, or hopefully more easily understood text that gets people to where they need to get to much more efficiently. So again, clear, actionable checklist. The one thing we did was we tried to make it friendly, right? We tried to kind of take a little bit of the intimidation out of the process. If you can see, it says, So this folder will help walk you through the application. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call us. Reminding them that we already spoke with them on the phone. And again, making it as easy to understand as we possibly could, okay? And we even put a little smiley face on the bottom there, if you can see. Okay. So all kinds of interventions built into this. Here are the emails I talked about before. Here are examples of some of the emails we sent to people. So again, you can see the friendly personal don'ts. We've actually put a picture of some person that's reaching out to them to kind of help them understand that this is coming from a human. We made sure that it arrived at the right time. So the idea that it's supposed to be there, in a short enough amount of time before you get the call or receive the application, such that you don't forget about it when that actually happens. And then again, try to help them make the right preparation, right? So help get their documents together. So you can see, this kind of easy checklist that says, as a reminder, here's what you need to send, the completed and signed application form, blah, 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 blah. And then you're in the home stretch, right? All you got to do now is send it back. So try to help really walk people through the process and be as sympathetic as we could along the way, understanding that this is a hard and tough process. So what does this do? Well, it improves the rate, first of all, at which people promised to, this is kind of Great Lakes terminology, but the rate at which people basically said that they would fill out these applications. So in some sense, strengthening people's intention in the first instance to even want to apply. So that's one good thing. Then the next good thing is that it actually improved the return rates by 18% for IBR applications, for income-based repayment applications. It did not do this now for the other ones, okay? And why might that be? Well, we have a hypothesis that the IBR is particularly complicated and involves people in particularly difficult circumstances, right? These are people generally who if you're in delinquency and you're being offered IBR, generally it's because you don't have a lot of income in the first place. And so, this is a kind of nice result for us that we're able to increase the rates at which people are actually returning their applications, with these very, very low-cost interventions, right? Just sending a few emails and this like one little checklist thing. Now, I think we could have done a better job for these other ones. We have to look into each specific form and what the differences are. But the IBR one is definitely a very, very complicated process. And the fact that we're able to see movement there makes this a very worthwhile thing to do. And for the mailed application, so they do this two ways. They send the application by email and they send it by mail. And for the mail one, this makes us particularly confident in our designs because we see a big increase. Now here we see 41% of people that sent back their application when we sent the mailed application. And so that speaks to the degree to which this kind of folder aid helps people think through the decisions they have to make and then make them. Great. Okay, so what are the takeaways? Well, one is that we can actually improve the way this process works for people without actually changing it, in a sense. Like, without changing any of the incentives, without changing any of the information that we're giving people, simply just by changing the way we present the information and present the incentives, we can make big changes on it overall, and using communications as this touch point. We can personalize emails, we can do these little things, and if we had the opportunity to do more outreach, if we'd be able to send even more emails or texts, or if we were able to, we didn't make any changes to the way that they called students or borrowers, for example, so we'd be able to do those things, we might be able to make much more impact. And think about the scalability of this. So at scale, each additional completed IBR application would only have cost about $8 to $17 under this intervention. Okay, that's tiny if you think about the value, not just to Great Lakes, but overall to the kind of to the students. If you think about that, of having completed that application. So it's incredibly important to maximize the value that we're trying to get from these communications and from this outreach. And the other important point I want to make is about technology. And people have mentioned this in different ways so far in the sessions I've been in today. Technology is obviously a great innovation, but it's only useful in the extent to which it helps people make these decisions and take these actions, right? So a lot of times if we simply think that putting something online is going to be the answer, and it's part of the answer, but it's clear to us that it's not the whole answer. Right? The most important answer is making things easy, and actually the intervention here that worked the best was this mailed, checklist that fits over your application form, and that's nothing technological, right? That's something you could have done 20, 30 years ago without a problem. In fact, probably more easily then. But it makes a huge impact, okay? So it's not the technology that matters as much, it's the way in which we present choices and facilitate actions that matters. And technology can go a long way towards improving those, but only if we do it the right way. Okay, I'm pushing up against lunch here, so I'm only gonna talk for another 5 minutes, I promise. Okay, so I'm gonna do one quick example here, and this is at Valencia College, a community college in Orlando, where we're a little bit further back in the loan process. We wanted to help students choose the right repayment plan because we believe that students are not doing so. One of the things that makes us believe that is this middle statistic here, which is that at Valencia, almost a third of people are delinquent before they ever even make a payment. Okay, so that they're coming right out of their grace period and are sliding automatically into delinquency. And the idea is if they had the right repayment plan, they wouldn't need to do that. They'd be able to make these payments, and then this other statistic here that when you're in the standard default repayment plan, which is the 10-year loan repayment plan, you're more than 3 times more likely to be delinquent. All right, so probably there are some people here who would switch that are not switching if given the opportunity or engaged in the right way. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the idea is that there are a bunch of things that happen while you're in school to help you think about the loan process, but that's actually not the moment at which you're able to make the switch to a repayment plan if you want to. Right? That moment actually comes later when you're in your grace period or afterward, when you're no longer in contact with the school. Okay, so the entire environment in which you first encountered the repayment process is not the environment in which you actually have to decide to do something about it. And that's a critical distinction that's good, and it turns out to matter quite a lot for people, I think, later on, because they don't even know that they can switch when they're not prompted to switch by the time that they actually have to. So it's worth, again, thinking about what the kind of default system that people use is to think about their repayment plans. This is what the Department of Education website looks like, okay? I'm not gonna trash the website too much, but it's not a terrible website by any means, but if you think about the way the information's presented, there's a lot of it. The language is difficult, and it's very hard to compare across these things. Like, they've done their best to set up the comparison here through this table, but it's very difficult to see what actually matters here, and then to make the calculations one has to make to know which plan is going to be right for me. So here's what we did. We did a kind of lab study where we took actual students that are at Valencia College, and we changed the names of these plans. So we thought that just the fact that the standard plan might be called standard might make a difference, all right? And we simply just changed these to totally neutral color names. And we made the information that actually matters salient. So we kind of changed up the, all the information that was here before, right? So look at the years, for example, right? 10 years, 25 years. So now we simply just put these years into the plan in a much more salient way and took out all the noise. And we kind of calculated for them what their monthly payment amounts will be, because that's really the calculation that they need to make, right? And these are just averages for the student population that we're dealing with. So we just wanted to see whether this would make a difference in how people made the decision. Now, we can't really actually measure people's decisions here, right? Because this is just, they can't make the decision while they're in school. Okay, so how did people decide once we made this information more salient for them? Well, they took the factors that actually matter much more into consideration when deciding, okay? Not across the board. We see trending effects on the payment itself and a repayment term, but the things that seem to really catch people's eye for some reason were the interest and then the name of the plan, right? And people here took the name into consideration much less when they were the kind of neutral colors as opposed to the standard or graduated or whatever. So again, the idea that the way we're presenting this information actually really matters for the way that people are thinking about it. And we think that leads to the way that they act on it as well, but of course we can't know that until we actually test it in the context. And again, people remembered the information much more when we presented it in this more salient way. So if your goal is to try to get people to make a decision at some point in the future, and you want them to remember information they would have learned previously, you may as well make that information easy to remember, right? And so just doing that seems to have this big effect on people actually remembering the information afterward. And again, it's very hard to measure the choices of the plans, but we tried to kind of get people to make some kind of choice. And we saw some movement away from the standard plan, but not a huge amount, and the sample size was different, so it's kind of hard to compare. So I'm not gonna spend too much on that. But the takeaways here are basically that if you give people we can get people to change the way that they make the choice simply just by changing the way we present the information and how we show it to people. And it's important to, and so the previous study was about the servicer or the guarantor reaching out to students, and this one is about actually doing this while people are at school. And again, my point is that these things should be married together in some way. So we should actually allow people to make this choice in an environment which is familiar to them. And if you think about it, when the guarantor or the servicer is reaching out, they're now way out of that environment, in some cases years beyond when they've been in the environment in which they first learned about these things. And it's no longer an optimal moment for them to decide. And so one thing we're doing now is working with Valencia to try to see if we can get them to reach out to borrowers more directly that are after graduation or after separation from the school in order to use their branding and their kind of cachet with borrowers more effectively to make them comfortable making these types of decisions. It's actually taking the servicer out of the process a little bit more intentionally. And that's something for you that are working at institutions I would recommend you do as well if this is an issue of concern. Okay, how to become a behavioral innovator? even outside of any of these projects I showed you, easier than you think. You can do all kinds of different things. One thing you can do is you can send personalized prep or reminder emails. Very, very easy. All you need is a platform that allows you to do that, and a way of getting data on borrowers and the decisions and actions that they make so that you can run a test and figure out whether it worked or not. But all you need is the email system, send it to a bunch of, if you're asking people to fill in a form, let's say, or you're asking people to show up at an event, or you're asking people to be reminded about something, simply just send an email, send a bunch of them, send it before the event, send it after the event to remind them, and be intentional about how you communicate. You can use checklists, right, as a way of simplifying information, making it intuitive, and giving people a way of tracking their progress toward achieving some goal. Again, very low cost. It doesn't have to be technological. You can just hand people a checklist as opposed to some long kind of information sheet. Make the information intuitive. And as a bonus, there's more and more texting platforms that are out there now that have shown to be very, very effective. Some great research has come out of a researcher in particular at University of Virginia called Ben Castleman, who's been able to show that if you simply send students 8 text messages over the course of the summer in between their first and second year, you get people to enroll at a much higher rate. You get people to come back for the second year at a much higher rate. There's always some natural drop-off between that first and second year. It's called summer melt. If you get people if you simply send people these text messages over the summer, it keeps the matter salient for them in their mind, and they're able to come back at a much higher rate than if you don't. So collect people's cell phone numbers if you can. I know that's a bottleneck for a lot of schools. And then it's cheap and easy to use different texting platforms. The one we're plugging here is Signalvine, because we use them on a bunch of our projects, but any number of different texting platforms one can use to manage this process. And then all of these solutions require, very importantly, obviously high-level support within the institution, which kind of comes with a certain culture of experimentation and innovation. So it's important to basically take ownership of the idea that what we're trying to do is to get students to do certain things that are important for them to do using non-traditional means. And even though our programs may work great the way they currently are, it may work even better if we tailor them or tweak them a little bit. And so getting the permission to do that is obviously very important. And then a careful investigation of the context. So not everything works all the time, right? And it's important to really think hard about what might be motivating certain actions or certain decisions. If you remember back to when I showed you our process, that diagnosis part, where we're really diving deeply into what the context is. What does the form look like? What is the box checked or unchecked on that form? What do the emails look like that they're getting? What are their friends saying? How many people are around them when they're making this decision? Thinking about those part of the context points the way to what innovation is the best to use in that context. So think very intentionally about that. So I'm going to stop there and let you guys eat lunch, but first I'll take a few questions if I can. I was told I was allowed to run over, so I've certainly abused that. But why don't I take a few questions? Yes?
Just a quick question. Are things, resources like that FAFSA overlay, are those publicly available?
Great question. So in different forms. One way that they're available is through the Nudging for Success report, in which we've done our best to try to make implement the kind of designs themselves easy to use and easy to copy for practitioners. So I definitely advise checking that out. The other way is through a website that we're currently creating called the Behavioral Evidence Hub, which is going to have, it's basically going to be a catalog of behavioral innovations that have been tried in different sectors, including in higher education, with details and specifics for how to implement them in context for practitioners to make it even easier for people to adopt these things, and also provide a way for you to get in touch with the researchers that did them if you have specific questions about how to do it. So that's coming soon. We're going to launch that in January. So if you go to ideas42.org, you can sign up for our listserv and be notified of when that happens. Yeah, in the back.
Hello. Oh, Jesus. We find that sort of the black box where a lot of things go wrong is that there isn't communication between the servicer and the university, and the borrower sort of gets caught in the middle.
Yep.
And I wondered, having worked on both sides of that equation, if you see culturally that's sort of the way it is, or is there an opportunity there to create new pathways to help borrowers?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm actually not very well qualified to answer. But I can tell you from our experience, the main bottleneck that we've tried to do this, and I think we'll be more successful as we try even harder. But the main bottleneck for us has actually been data sharing. So the FERPA regulations and the different, and it's kind of constantly changing. I'm sure you guys know more about this than I do. But the idea of knowing which borrowers are in what kind of trouble is something that the servicers generally have, but that schools generally don't. And that's a hard link to try to make if you're trying to do targeted outreach to students. I know that there are some platforms that, so servicers are recognizing now the need to do this and to bring schools into the partnership. And so there are certain platforms that that certain servicers are starting to offer. And my guess is under the new servicing plan that the RFP for which just came out from the Department of Education, there's going to be a much greater focus on bringing schools into the borrower experience. Yeah, but I know of a couple of these platforms that already exist. I don't think that they're fantastic, to be frank with you. I don't think that they provide that great optionality or the opportunity to innovate off of them, but these things do exist. That and basically the way that they work, in my understanding, is the servicer basically dumps a bunch of data on the schools, and you can sign into the platform and see which students are delinquent, and then there's email options where you can just click on this kind of batch of students and send some batch email that it reaches out to them or something like that. So there are certain technology solutions that already exist, but I don't think they're great, and I think they're going to get better. Anything else? I know people are hungry. I would have designed the context differently if I got to choose my own spot. All right. Well, thanks again. Bon appetit. And I hope you'll be in touch. Okay, thank you guys.
Lunch will be across the street again, where we had dinner last night. So I hope everyone will join us for lunch.